Hello again, Dr. Williams. This video addresses the third prompt, which involves a case study and application of two separate theories to that case study. So for this case study, I'll share about of course, names are changed, about a couple named John and Hannah who came in for marital therapy and had some very severe marital conflict to the point of being separated at the time of counseling that rooted back in some family of origin experiences that each had had. John had had the experience of his father being very emotionally withdrawn and then gradually more so physically withdrawn, and to the point that eventually the parents separated and divorced without ever speaking about the divorce. His dad was just gone more and more, and there was never a time that they talked and spoke with him and let him know that they were no longer going to be married. It just happened, and he had to draw his own conclusions about it. Even as an adult, it was still an unmentionable topic. His wife had a very different emotional experience in her family, lots of dysfunction there as well, but it tended toward conflict, loud and wild conflict that left some very anxious behaviors in some very anxious responses for her. And so she had a very clear memory of abandonment, very clear memory of the last fight and how one parent left and the other parent emotionally fell apart. And she would often reenact some of that emotional falling apart as a means to keep John from abandoning her. And his tendency toward being very emotionally stoic felt like abandonment for her. And the more stoic he would become, the more histrionic she would become, and the more he would resent that and withdraw even more. So they had a very difficult systemic problem that they were presenting with. And I'd like to apply both Gestalt therapy and then Adlerian therapy to their case. So with Gestalt therapy, we would look at some primary tenets of the therapy and the way that that would inform interventions and conceptualization. Contact is really important in Gestalt therapy. And so the contact not only between the therapist and the clients, in this case, two clients, and having a very real and meaningful, in this moment, here and now connection without hiding behind anything, without hiding behind past or future, without hiding behind disempowered language like, oh, it's just really hard to be in a marriage like this, but instead using empowered language and without hiding behind withdrawal or other tactics. So that would be an important one. Also, Gestalt is going to rely on confrontation, although the traditional, no one's quite as confrontational as Fritz Perls, and most modern Gestalt therapists are not going to have that level of confrontation, but still that's in the roots of Gestalt therapy. And so noticing things that are going on within a system or within a client and being willing to confront those for the good and for change would be a real hallmark. And that's something that played out in this therapy experience, that when John would start to withdraw, he would be confronted with that and asked to change and asked to find a different pattern. Also important in Gestalt therapy is here and now ownership. And so personal ownership of a problem rather than putting responsibility on others to change. And so that was something that was really key and foundational to the conceptualization of this case, that each partner really wanted to say, well, I wouldn't do this thing if my partner wasn't doing this thing. And it was a very difficult shift to get them to take an ownership of their own experience and from that ownership choose a different path. So some interventions that helped to do that were particularly, and interventions are a big part of Gestalt therapy and also make Gestalt therapy a lot of fun and very spontaneous and very unpredictable. But some interventions that we used were changing places in an argument. And I like to do that with having them even change, if one of them is wearing sunglasses and the other one's wearing a hat, having them do that and even literally change places on the couch, because that provides contact with the conflict. And what I mean by that is they're talking over a conflict that they've had many, many times before about each of their emotional styles, but they're doing it in a repetitive way and getting them to change places and not just kind of intellectually say from a distance what their partner's take on the situation would be, but actually experience and be in that moment of feeling and expressing what their partner would say. was a really important intervention, and also a way that we conceptualized the case to go beyond just an intellectualization into an experience. It's very typical of Gestalt therapy. Some ways that multicultural considerations should be applied when utilizing Gestalt therapy would be determining whether the person or people that you're working with are very individualistic or whether they're collectivistic, because that could inform the interventions. As in, would I do an intervention that would really increase contact with one individual, or would I try to connect that to a greater whole, particularly if they're more of a society that views family as a unit, and so that could be really important, maybe involving other family members in the therapy, whether in actuality or just in some role playing scenarios. Confrontation would be an important multicultural consideration, meaning within this person's cultural context, and is confrontation acceptable, and by whom and to whom, and is that gendered? And so therefore, does it matter that a female therapist is going to gently confront some things that a male in this family is doing, and to what degree has he taken in and absorbed toxic masculinity or messages about his gender from his culture? Also, disempowered language, which is something that we look for in Gestalt therapy, could be viewed within a multicultural and feminist lens as well. Is that a gendered behavior? So is that something that, while it still may need to change regardless of its reason, it would be very important to view it within its context? Did disempowered language, such as, well, when you have such a difficult partner, sometimes so that stepped back, very disempowered language is very typical of certain cultures in particular, where women are not taught assertive and direct communication. And so it could be important consideration when you applying Gestalt toward this or any other case. If we were to apply Adlerian therapy to this case, we would really start with the Adlerian concept of encouragement and engagement. So Adler was so collaborative in his approach, and so much wanted to build everything off of a great connection with his clients. And so he would often use encouragement as what he called a way of being. And I love that concept and love that thought of encouraging, whether we're encouraging just a single client or a dyad. We're really noticing when something good occurs and really encouraging and highlighting that for them. Another thing that is important in Adlerian therapy would be the assessment phase, and sometimes a family constellation that Adler would do. And so that was something that we did in this scenario. We really tried to gain some insight of how their families of origin had impacted their conflict styles, their own internal response to conflict, and then the way that conflict played out between the two of them. Then the reorientation phase is really important as well in Adlerian therapy, and a way that went from conceptualization to actual steps in this case was a reorientation, a new skill building phase, particularly for John, needing a broader emotional vocabulary because he had grown up in a very emotionally stilted home, and practicing, even in therapy, utilizing words and phrases and even being more open non-verbally in therapy was important. For Hannah, some reorientation involved letting go of the notion that only John could satisfy her emotional needs, and that she needed to turn up the emotional volume in order to have that occur. And one of the new skills that she found was finding ways to self-calm and self-care that did not involve and hinge completely on him. And so she broadened her social circle, and she started to gain some support from some other people close in her life. They were a very religious family, and so they had some support from their church, from a few people within their church to help them do that. So some multicultural aspects of the Adlerian theory would be wondering what expectations there are for relationships. What expectations are there for, let's say, a therapy relationship based on a cultural experience? Are your clients expecting a very directive approach, or are they expecting a very collaborative and encouraging approach? And so with this particular couple, they were very culturally like their therapist, which is a time when things can happen without lots of extra thought. Still, of course, there's multicultural considerations in every case, but I chose this case in part because it it would seem like we don't need to look at those multicultural considerations because our cultures are so similar, when in fact it's always vital. Even if on the outside it looks like the cultures are very similar, there are going to be significant differences in the way that we view the world. And so finding out what they had learned from their families of origin as far as the rules of who speaks and how much and how emotions work, that was a very interesting process. Another thing that was really important in this case was respecting their religion, which was very different from their therapist's place as far as religion is concerned, but really learning about how their deeply held religious beliefs played into their decisions about marriage and messages that they'd gotten about marriage and about divorce, and some of the shame that they carried because of their parental divorces and being from homes where parental divorce is kind of shunned, and some of the impact that that carried for them was really formative in the therapy process. There are several ways that Gestalt therapy and Adlerian therapy are very similar. One being the way that they both view relationship as so important. So therapist-client relationship. In Gestalt, they're going to call it contact. In Adlerian, they're going to call it encouragement. And those two have a lot of very similar elements being foundational. Another place that they're similar would be about insight. They both really emphasize insight into how and why certain behaviors are occurring, and having that insight as a prerequisite for behavioral change. They also are each a very here and now focused therapy. So, of course, past and future can be involved in the therapy, but the crux and the main part of the therapy was how are we experiencing in this moment what we're experiencing now. And so that's another place that they were very similar. There are some differences, though. With Gestalt, there was a bit more of an emphasis on personal responsibility, and each individual within that dyad taking personal responsibility. Whereas with Adlerian therapy, there was a little bit more of a skills-based format, which meant that the skills were utilized between the two. So it was a bit more dyadic. There was also a difference in the aspect that Gestalt could be a bit more confrontational. As I said, I'm not a very confrontational Gestalt therapist, but it leans itself more toward confronting areas where a person's not taking personal responsibility, whereas the Adlerian therapy tended to lean more on noticing what they're doing well, building on positives, and really encouraging skills as we started to see them emerge. So both schools of thought really brought a lot to the table in this scenario, and I love this idea of taking two different theories and trying to apply them to a case, because really in clinical work, it's wonderful to be able to take all different theories and find the things that are most meaningful for a particular case without having to adhere entirely and completely to one particular theory. And so this has been a really enjoyable process to think through how certain aspects of each of those theories were more helpful than others, and those were the ones that rise to the top. And it's a lot of fun to think about therapy as a really creative endeavor in which we take each of the theories that we learn about and utilize them both foundationally in our mind as we're conceptualizing cases, but also finding sometimes that there's really one intervention or one way of being or something that helps us really thrive in a particular case. So again, thank you for the opportunity to answer this question.